Welcome to the Marconi Project, an oral history series of the Italian American Museum of Washington, D.C. In these interviews, we capture the memories and experiences of Italian immigrants and Italian Americans in the nation's capital. We are ready to hear your story.
This is an interview with Lynn Rose Sorbara on March 17th, 2024. Welcome, Lynn.
Thank you very much. It is quite an honor to be able to speak with you. Again, my name is Lynn Rose Sorbara. I was born in Queens, New York, and I lived most of my life in 4 of the 5 boroughs. My family, my father's family, came from a very small town called Polistena, which is about 50 miles north of Reggio Calabria. My mother's family is from a town called Russetano in the province of Caltanissetta in Sicily.
What were your parents' names?
My mom's name was, she wasn't called this. It was Americanized. Her name was Dominica, and they called her Minnie. And my father's name was Domenico, and they called him Dom. So the Domenico and Domenica found each other. I have one brother who was named after my grandfather, and his name is Robert Fortunato Sorbara. I know a little bit about the ancestry of my family. I've done quite a bit of research, both speaking to family members and also doing genealogy research. So I can tell you a little bit about my grandparents. My maternal grandparents met on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and unlike many of others during this time, it was not an arranged marriage. My grandfather said he was enchanted with my grandmother and asked her father if he could court her. But since she was only 13 years old, he was asked to wait, and he did. He waited 2 years, and they were married when she was 15 in Transfiguration Church on Mott Street in Manhattan, which, by the way, is still a Catholic church. My paternal grandparents had an arranged marriage in Italy, and I really do not know much about the relationship between their two families.
Why did your parents leave Italy to come to America, your grandparents?
It's always an interesting story as far as I can tell in talking to other people. My maternal great-grandfather was born in 1950, but died suddenly from a fall off of a roof of his barn in 1903. He left 8 children ranging in age from 25 to 2 years. My grandfather's eldest brother, my grandfather was in the middle child, but his eldest brother, whose name was Carmelo, came to the United States 1 year later in 1904 to work on the New York City docks and make enough money to bring the remaining family to America. By 1905, he in fact did make enough money and did reunite the family in New York City. And in fact, he also got married and lived in a tenement house on the Lower East Side. There's an interesting story about this, and I'll tell you a little bit more. While he was living in this tenement house, his new wife, is now pregnant with their child, and a next-door neighbor was screaming that her husband was beating her. So my great-uncle Carmelo saved the lady from being beaten, and 3 days later, the lady's husband came back with a gun and shot and killed him. My grandfather always talked about his brother as being a hero, but I never really knew the whole story. And through all of my ancestry and genealogy studies, I found a newspaper article about this, as well as the trauma unit report of his injuries, and also the autopsy report. I discovered that he was buried in a cemetery in Queens, New York, one of the largest cemeteries in the world, but they were very poor, and he was buried in Potter's Field. Now, having these documentation, I was able to go to the office of the cemetery and actually find the site that he was buried. I then got my cousins together, and we had a little ceremony at his burial site, which was 103 years after he died.
a story, Lynn.
Yeah.
But some of your family went to New Orleans, correct?
Yes. That was my maternal father's family, but my maternal mother's family, they came to New York City, and many of them, got jobs in the garment center and garment industry. But my grandmother's uncles took the offer to go to New Orleans and have a farm. Now, some of you may be familiar with some of the turmoil that was going on in New Orleans with Sicilians, but they did manage to get a farm right outside of the French Quarter. And they did very, very well, and they sent a lot of, funds back to Sicily. And to thank God for their good fortune, they built a little chapel on their property. Well, unfortunately, the Ku Klux Klan, who kind of looked at Sicilians as, the people who were not exactly up to the white idea, sometimes they were even called black on the census, they burnt down their chapel. My two great uncles, not to be discouraged, they rebuilt the chapel, and in fact, a couple of months later, it was burnt down a second time. Well, there is some kind of resolution to this because my uncles successfully confronted the Klan leaders and made arrangements to live peacefully side by side and to not be bothered in the future. But as you know, this was not an easy time for Sicilians in New Orleans in the turn of the century.
It was around the time of the mass lynching.
Yes, it was a little bit later than that, but yes, it was around that time.
Well, growing up, what traditions and customs were followed by your family? I noticed today we're celebrating St. Joseph's Table in our church. Did your family follow that tradition also?
Well, as a matter of fact, yes. I lived in the same house as my maternal grandparents, and they lived in the basement of this house, and we lived upstairs in a very small 2.5-room apartment, and my mom's sister lived across the way in another 2.5-room apartment. So I grew up really together with an extended family, but St. Joseph's Day was extremely important in our family. My grandmother would wake up very, very early, wee hours of the morning, and start cooking and baking. And she would set everything out on a long table in the dining room, which extended into the living room. When she was ready, the priest from our local parish came and blessed the table. The interesting thing to me, even as a child, was she would open the doors and anybody and everyone would just come in and partake in the food. Most of the time, we didn't know who these people were because there were factories around the area where we lived, and word got around that Mrs. LaRocca was having her special day, and people would come and enjoy the food. And all I remember as a child is washing a lot of dishes. There were no paper dishes back then, and I washed a lot of dishes.
I bet your neighbors marked that day on their calendar.
I'm sure that they did, yeah. And, it was interesting because I still, to this day, kind of celebrate a little bit. When I was working, I would make Sfingi di Santa Giuseppe and bring them into work and explain to people what the holiday was. We also did some special things for St. Lucy's Day. I think it's a particularly Sicilian holiday, but we ate the cuccia, which was a kind of porridge that you made out of wheat berries. And so we learned a lot of these traditions and in turn learned the religious and historical significance of it as well. So I'm very grateful to that because, and I don't think I would have had that had I not been in the same house as my grandparents.
Yes. Now, tell me about the pigeon club that you used to have. That's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Well, I'm not sure how Italian-American this was or if it was Italian-American Queens and Brooklyn. I'm not sure. But my grandfather had a 3-story building in our backyard where he raised homing pigeons successfully. He was one of the most successful trainers and racers of homing pigeons. And I'm sure he didn't know anything about genetics, but somehow he knew how to crossbreed the pigeons. And I was fascinated as a child because there were the babies, the little fledglings on the first floor, and the middle floor was the older pigeons, and then he would race them at the top floor. And they had these special, I will write about it one day, they had these special clocks from Germany where the little links on the ankles of the birds would be taken off when the bird returned from the race, and it would be put into the clock, and it would stop the clock. So everyone would know whose bird came home the fastest.
I assume some gambling.
Oh, there was a little money involved, yeah. But it got to be a very important thing in the area that we lived in. And in fact, my uncle, my grandfather's son, became the president of this organization that was Brooklyn and Queens homing pigeon racing club, or whatever it was called, I'm not sure. But it has been written about quite a bit in the newspapers at times. So
what was your father's first job? And
yeah, my father's family, I didn't talk a lot about them. My father's family, I'll backtrack a little bit, was quite poor, even by immigrant standards. My grandfather came to this country in 1909 to make some money, and then he wanted to bring his family here, but he couldn't right away. World War I broke out. Anyway, ultimately, my grandmother and her daughter, who came to the United States in 1920, a lot of children died. My father had several brothers and sisters between him and his eldest sibling, and he was the baby, and there was 20 years between him and his older sister. So by the time my father was born, his older sister was already married and out of the house. They lived in a tenement house on Lower East Side of Brooklyn. And I still remember that house because they lived there until both of my grandparents died. The thing about it was that they were very poor, and so when my father was 8 years old, he was sent to work in a tobacco factory. So here he is, this little boy, using a pitchfork to throw tobacco into a toaster. And as my father jokingly said, he only had the job for 2 weeks because he accidentally threw the pitchfork into the toaster. So that didn't last very long.
Now, how did you go from this background of basically growing up in poverty to a PhD at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine?
So my dad was always very interested in education, even if he did not have the opportunities that I had. When he came back, he served in World War II. When he came back, he was on the GI Bill, and he went to get his degree from an art school in Manhattan. And one of his classmates in the art school was also on the GI Bill, and his name was Antonio Benedetto, Tony Bennett.
Wow.
And so they became fast friends. My father always felt that education was important, and he was trying very hard to make it as an artist. And he was very talented, but it was very hard to support a family on what you could make. And so he got a job initially in a steel mill, and then eventually he worked for the city of New York as a draftsman. When he got to be 39 years old, he wanted to actually be a certified bachelor's degree architectural draftsman and went to school at night. Unfortunately, he died in 1970 at 42 years old, right before he was able to get his degree. But always he pushed education for us. And so for me, I worked all through high school, after school, to help support the family. And when it was time to go to college, it was very difficult because of the money issue. And so I really have to thank one of my teachers in high school who supported me, got me involved in getting a scholarship, and explained to me that Hunter College of the City of New York was free. And so I managed to get to Hunter College, but at the same time I also worked more than 30 hours a week as a secretary for a steamship agency that was headed by Aristotle Onassis. So I have lots of wonderful experiences in that respect. And actually, at one point, I actually was his secretary for about 6 months. So it was quite an experience for a little 18, 19, 20-year-old young woman. But anyway, I finished my college education and really wanted to move forward. And it was particularly important for me because when my father died in 1970, we didn't know what he died from. No one knew what celiac disease was back then, and it did compromise his immune system. And as it turns out, my brother has celiac and I have celiac, but we know that now, and we didn't know that back then. And so one of the things that was important to me was I wanted to study medicine and research so that other people wouldn't be put in a situation of having a trauma of losing a parent and not even knowing why. And so that always was in the back of my mind. I wanted to make sure that my research had meaning, that it was part of a clinical situation to help people. And in fact, my thesis was in a drug called Taxol, which up until recently was the most widely used chemotherapeutic drug in the world. And our laboratory back then discovered the mechanism of action. And there are some funny stories with this as well. I would have to go to, Max Cohen's slaughterhouse in Elizabeth, New Jersey to get calf brains to do some of the research that we were doing on the Taxol. But after that, I was just very determined to continue doing clinical work, to do research and to do medicine that would help many people.
Is that what led you to coming to Washington?
Yes, I initially came down when I was a junior faculty at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York, just to learn how to sequence DNA. And people think now, it's easy, you put it in a machine and 2 hours later you get your sequence. Well, we used to do this by hand, and it took days to do. And so I came to NIH to learn that. And then a couple of months later, they called me to tell me that there was an opening at the National Cancer Institute, and I just could not turn down this offer. This was just, a gift from God, really. And so ultimately, I had my own laboratory. It was a molecular diagnostics laboratory where we developed tests for DNA and RNA to help support diagnostics of very difficult cases. And then finally, I worked as a actually, let me go back. When I had my laboratory, it was in this capacity that I got the opportunity to meet Dr. Anthony Fauci. He would come to the lab to look for some of the results on some of his patients, and we would chit-chat. And he would hear my Brooklyn accent, and I would hear his Brooklyn accent, and we would have little conversations about growing up in an Italian-American community. And at one point, he actually gave me his mother's recipe for marinara sauce, but for the life of me, I cannot find that piece of paper.
Oh, keep looking.
I would love to have it now. But anyway, ultimately, I became a program director. I was overseeing 50 laboratories and programs around the country. And I think the most important thing that I did was I developed my own program and was able to get it funded by the United States government. And it was involved in trying to find new technologies for early cancer detection by what we call now liquid biopsy, which is a very hot topic now. And when I started this several years ago, it was really pretty new. I also had the opportunity to work on the Moonshot program for COVID during the COVID epidemic. So I really thank God, and I thank all my teachers and all my support systems for allowing me to do something that I really love to do.
Amazing. Well, you did have one relative in Washington, right, when you moved here? Your uncle?
Oh, yes. I did have an uncle who owned a restaurant right near the National Cathedral. It was called Enzio's Italian Cuisine, and he was a wonderful man. When I first came down here and I didn't know anybody, I worked in his, helped out. I can't say worked. I helped out in his restaurant on the weekends. Ultimately, he got a really bad stroke, and his wife and children tried to keep the restaurant going. But I used to go to visit him, and I would bring him his favorite treat, which was my homemade arancini. And he used to tell me that my arancini would be the only thing to get him out of bed, to sit up at the table to eat the arancini. So I guess they were pretty good.
Must have been.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what is your relationship with Italy now? Do you ever go back? Do you want to?
Oh, yes. I mean, I have only been to Italy twice. The most recent time was actually quite a while ago, but I decided I really wanted to see the people in the countryside. And so a couple of friends and I rented a car, and we drove from Rome all the way down to the tip of Calabria and across into Puglia, and then up the Adriatic side. We went to see Padre Pio's, sanctuary and that sort of thing. And then we crossed the mountains back into Rome. And for me, it was such a memorable experience because we got to see the real people. We got to talk to people. We got to visit the places that are not on the tourist, areas, and see the beaches and the churches, and just have a situation where we could do what we wanted to do when we wanted to do it, and really enjoy the atmosphere and the people. And I just fell in love with it, and I really would like to go back. My partner has been to northern Italy, which I have not been to, so we're planning to do one of these trips where I get to see the northern part of Italy and he gets to see the southern part of Italy. So we hope that that's going to be in our future.
Good. Well, Lynn, I know you've been a parishioner of Holy Rosary. You've attended the Italian Mass for years. How did you first connect with Holy Rosary, and what does it mean to you now?
I was looking for a place that I could feel connected to my family and my traditions. And when I first came here, I didn't have that. And I started to look for various organizations. And the first thing I did was I joined the, Sons and Daughters of Italy and the Italian Cultural Society. And through some of those people, I found out that there was a place called Casa Italiana and Holy Rosary. And I was thrilled to hear about it. And I just started to attend, even though it was a bit of a trip from where I lived, but it was worth it. And every time I came down here, it felt like home. And it allowed me to connect with people, to relive some of my traditions. It was a place of spirituality. It was a place where I could pray as well as enjoy the camaraderie of the people. I was able to get involved in a way that I hadn't expected. I joined the Abruzzo and Molise Heritage Society, and in fact, until recently, I was one of the vice presidents. It allowed me to participate in their events, help with the hospitality, and really meet such a variety of people that I felt a connection to. And I feel very fortunate about that because you don't normally get that when you go to your church.
I think you once gave a talk to Abruzzo Molise Heritage Society on early cancer detection. So you kind of combined your two interests.
Correct. And I think that, that was an important thing for me because I felt like I was able to bring important information to people in a way that they could understand it. And it actually led me to do a lot more of this with nonprofit organizations. I now am also a member of the National Organization of Italian American Women, and I've given talks there, and I've given talks at the Sons and Daughters of Italy. So I think my being able to bring my knowledge of medicine and research and cancer to people in a way that is more understood is a plus.
We're very glad you made your way to Washington. Tell us the story about your father, when you're growing up. What did you have to eat? How did you manage to survive?
Yeah, as I mentioned, my father's family was quite poor, even by standards back then. And my grandmother was taking laundry in and doing all sorts of things. And my grandfather had a heart condition, so he couldn't work. So my grandmother would give my dad a few pennies, and he would go to the bakery at the end of the day so that he could buy the leftover stale bread, and he would bring it home. My grandmother would heat it up, and she would sprinkle cinnamon on it, and that would be dinner. And so my dad would complain about it, and she would say to him, "Quando vera Pietro concede mangiare tutti," which translated, I believe, means when Pete with the sardines comes, you'll eat everything. What she really meant was, if you're hungry enough, you're going to eat this. So when we grew up, if we didn't like what was being served that day, my father would give us the same Pedro Cansade story, and we knew exactly what he meant.
This interview was submitted by Nancy DeSanti and recorded by Giovanni Scianameo on March 17th, 2024.